Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I want to start with a question for you. Have you ever lashed out at someone else or even in your head, and then been hit with a wave of guilt so strong that it left you ashamed and questioning who you are? That moment, when anger gives way to guilt, or guilt collapses into shame, is what we're going to unpack today. But we're going to do something different. I recently recorded an interview where we focused on the theory, on the frameworks that help us understand guilt and shame, where they come from, how they develop, and why they take hold the way they do. I also released an episode last week that looked specifically at shame in depth. So today, I want to shift gears. Instead of staying within the realm of theory, I want to trace how guilt and shame actually move through a person, how they defend against vulnerability, how they entrench and keep us stuck. That's what came up for me when I recently listened to a podcast that immediately caught my attention, not because it was dramatic, but because of how the therapist responded. Something about the exchange struck me. I found myself having a strong, complex reaction, and I wanted to share it with you and unpack it together. Let me set the stage. The moment comes from a popular podcast featuring a prominent therapist and author. I'll call him Dr. R, who's known for his work on relationships. He's written several well-known books. The host, also a very public figure, I'll refer to him as Frank to preserve some privacy for both parties. In this exchange, Frank, remember the host, recounts a moment where a late grocery store delivery sparked an internal storm of frustration, rage, guilt, and self-hate. But what makes this story so compelling isn't just how intense his reaction was. It raised questions that I want to invite you to wrestle with alongside of me. Was Dr. R's approach truly effective? That's the question I want you to think about. Did it manage to reach the part of Frank that was really hurting beneath all the anger and guilt? As we dive into this, I hope you'll reflect on what it means to really connect with those deeper wounds, and how the alternative psychodynamic approach that I'm going to share might open a new or different door that Frank hasn't been able to see or enter into before. To do that, let me take you into the moment itself, the story that Frank shared, the emotions just beneath the surface, and how the way that Dr. R responded to all this. This will give us a real sense of the dynamics at play before we explore how a psychodynamic perspective might offer something different. Let's get into it. This is the moment Frank shared, the one that set everything in motion and brought up all those deeper dynamics. Frank shares a story about waiting for a grocery delivery that kept getting delayed. He frames it as an example of, in his words, "What a grandiose prick I can be," unquote. So that's a quote. He had structured his whole evening around the timing of this delivery, and it kept getting pushed back. His frustration began to build. He was pacing, stewing, thinking, and I quote again, "I screwed up. I could have made dinner or ran some errands. What an idiot I am." When the delivery finally arrived, the woman showed up at the door sweating, apologetic, and explaining that some of the eggs had broken. And in that moment, something shifted. And let me just give you a quick note here. I don't usually use strong language on this podcast, but in this episode, I just want to forewarn you, I'll be keeping some of it in to stay true to the emotional intensity of the moment, for Frank, that is. So Frank says, "My God," Frank thought, "you asshole. How could you have almost torn into this person?" Instead, he told her not to worry about the eggs. "I hate eggs anyway," and then asked her if she wanted a drink. Later, reflecting on it, Frank said, "How did I get lucky in that moment? If I could reproduce that, I wouldn't be the piece of shit person that I am." That's when Dr. R stepped in and said, "You're not a piece of shit. You had empathy once you got past your indignation." Dr. R goes on to talk to Frank about how when the more helpless you feel, the more shame crept in. And the more shame, the angrier you became. Frank asked a question that cut through everything. Does the knowledge of that help us? It's such an incredibly important question. Does the knowledge of that help us? And it cuts to the heart of so many moments like this. When we understand why we react the way we do, does that actually soothe the pain underneath? Or are we just naming it while we're still caught up in its grip? What do you think? I would be curious to know how you understand this. Like, in other words, is this insight enough? Let's slow this down and take it apart, because what's happening here isn't just about groceries or a late delivery. It's a window into something much deeper. Here's one formulation, and I want to emphasize this, one formulation, because there are so many different ways just to conceptualize this little brief vignette. Frank sets the scene with a tone of self-awareness, calling himself, and again I quote, a grandiose prick, suggesting some insight into the part of himself that demands the world conform, I should say, to his internal order. Psychodynamically, this grandiosity likely serves as a defense against deeper vulnerabilities, feelings of helplessness, insignificance, or shame when things go unpredictably out of control. Again, you see, we don't know what it defends against because you'd have to get a lot closer to his experience. When the delivery gets delayed, it's not just an inconvenience. Perhaps, can you imagine, this is what we call a narcissistic injury. In other words, Frank feels injured, and narcissistic injuries, as some of you may know who've been following along with the podcast, oftentimes leads to aggression. Okay. So there's a narcissistic injury. The schedule falling apart becomes an assault on the self's omnipotence, and we see a quick collapse and the emergence of the other side of the grandiose structure. And I quote, I screwed up. I could have made dinner. What an idiot I am. In other words, instead of the grandiose self who has everything under control, we see the broken, defective self begin to emerge. The attack turns inward, and the fantasy is still about control. It's as if we're saying, if only I had made the right choice, things would have gone perfectly. That's sort of the inner logic behind the grandiose structure. The inner world does not accept limits, and you can hear shame, not just frustration and disappointment, and not a reality-based acceptance of limits. So again, all this is part of what we call the grandiose structure. That's the structure that holds together the narcissist. When the delivery woman arrives, she introduces an unexpected reality, right? Because sweating, apologetic, this is a human being who shows up, not the abstract object. And I use the word object, not incidentally, because in somebody's mind, like in Frank's mind, she's not a person. She's just something that's persecuting him. So she doesn't show up as an abstract object of Frank's projected rage. Remember, he's raging right now. Again, we don't know why. We speculated, right? All the things that are behind the grandiose structure. But we can say that he projected that because what? He's imagining or thinking, and this is why he's getting so angry, look at what she's doing to me. But when she shows up, like I said, an unexpected reality. So the shift now from projection to recognition is what takes place. So he's no longer just projecting. Now he's grounded in a certain reality when he sees this woman. And you can hear it. I quote, "My God, how could you have almost torn into this person?" This signals a return of empathy, a collapse of the grandiose self-structure, and a reconnection with reality. Okay, so just to review all that, in short, I am speculating that what we see in Frank's anger and distress is displaced. It's projected onto the delivery service, onto this woman, and imagined in a persecutory way. The delivery person becomes, and I quote, the bad object, right? Again, that use of object, because she's not a person at this point. And that, by the way, is an important distinction between shame and guilt. In guilt, you're dealing with another person, where in shame, you're dealing with just what we call part objects or persecutory objects. Anyway, so let's get back. So then what happens? Then, when this woman appears, the reality of the other breaks through the projection, the broken eggs, her sweating, her apology. That's what collapses the fantasy structure built upon rage, and it evokes empathy, right? That's what you heard. We heard that Frank became more empathic. Now, at a slightly deeper level, Frank's inner logic may look something like this. I must control the world in order to feel safe. If I can't control it, I must be a failure. If I'm a failure, I deserve punishment. And by the way, either directed outward, like in other words, he's going to attack this woman, so the punishment can be directed outward. Look at what the delivery woman did to hurt me. Or the punishment can be directed inward. And I quote, I'm a piece of shit. That's the aggression, by the way. But wait, maybe the world isn't punishing me. That's part of the inner logic, right? That's the other piece. Maybe it's full of people just like me, struggling, apologizing, and human, with thoughts and feelings. So that's what allowed, remember, I'm going through the inner logic, but that little piece of inner logic is what allowed Frank to calm down. This moment reveals the fragility of the grandiose position. It's not sustained through dominance, but collapses in the face of authentic contact with another person's subjectivity. Like, in other words, this is a real person. She's not an object. Another person's subjectivity, not objectivity like an object. So now that we've mapped out what Frank experienced and offered some psychodynamic formulations and the inner logic that was perhaps going on inside of him, the most important question becomes this. How do you actually work with this? How do you meet Frank in that place and begin to help him feel something other than rage or shame or guilt? How do you stay with the part of him that feels small, out of control, and terrified to admit it, and offer a different kind of holding, one that doesn't collapse into guilt or grandiosity, but allows something more integrated to emerge? So how do we stay with this? To answer that question, let's go back to Dr. R's intervention. He says, you're not a piece of shit. You had empathy. Then he continues, explaining to Frank that the more helpless you felt, the more shame crept in. And the more shame, the angrier you became. Remember that? I mentioned it a little bit earlier. And that's when Frank asked the question that cuts through everything. I'm just reviewing here to get all this fresh on your mind. But here's the central piece. Does the knowledge of that help us? Frank's question speaks to something we've all wrestled with. Okay, I get it. I see the pattern. But now what? Why doesn't knowing make this stop? His tone carries a mix of honesty, frustration, and maybe even despair. It's a confrontation with the limits of insight when the emotional intensity underneath is still running. So in other words, yes, there's insight, but the emotions are still there. So what does help? How do we talk to someone who's caught in this loop of control, shame, projection, guilt, and attack or collapse? So what helps? My experience has taught me that it's not explanation. It's not interpretation. In other words, making something that's not conscious conscious. It's not even insight, at least not initially. See, this stuff all helps at a later point in the process. And I've detailed this in earlier episodes that when working with somebody like this, it is a process and you have to begin. I always say this with more, not lower level, but beginning level interventions. These are what are considered higher level because they require a level of insight and understanding. So healing begins when we slow the moment down, when I help the patient return, not just with their mind, but with their body, their feelings, their associations, to the place in them that got them overwhelmed. That's where I start. I would say to Frank, you said you were pacing back and forth in the room. Can we go back there for a moment? Can you tell me, what were you thinking and feeling when you were pacing? What was happening inside of you? Or what was it you were imagining? What would happen if things kept going wrong? In other words, what were you picturing? This isn't about analyzing Frank's behavior, but about staying with the parts of Frank that were spinning, out of control, on scene, perhaps terrified. We aren't just naming a defense here. We're attempting to make contact with what preceded the defense. In other words, what led up to the anger. Dr. R's intervention, "You're not a piece of shit, you had empathy," was a kind of corrective. He perceptively names the cycle then. He goes on, helplessness equals rage, right? Helplessness equals shame. Shame, let me say it this way, shame leads to rage. Why? Because it's much more comfortable to be outwardly raging than it is to be inwardly shameful. And then rage leads to a disconnection from empathy. And that's a compelling formulation, right? It sounds very interesting. Helplessness, shame, shame, rage, rage, disconnect from empathy. But instead of offering it as knowledge, I'd want to help Frank discover it from inside. Let the truth emerge within the patient's own language, body, and feelings, not from outside. In other words, I'm not the authority telling Frank what's going on inside of him when I don't even know what's going on inside of him yet. Because when it comes from the inside, it's not just insight. It's contact with a side of oneself that's been split off and projected. There's different ways of saying that. It's getting in contact with oneself that maybe is in denial, or maybe is repressed, or maybe is compartmentalized, but you get the picture. It's not accessible. Contact, therefore, is what creates the possibility for something new. Now, just to review, Dr. R's immediate move is a powerful reparative gesture. You're not a piece of shit. But then he moves quickly into explaining and imparting knowledge. I would take a different route. I would lead with containment and recognition. I'd help Frank get closer to what we sometimes call the, and I'm quoting, unthinkable, that hidden, intolerable feeling at the root of the rage. I'd help him give that, again, unthinkable thing words, and from there, meaning. Okay, back to the original question. Is insight enough? What are you beginning to think?
Let's take a quick break.
I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, "Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly, but I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there. So when Frank asked, does the knowledge of that help us? There are a few levels to address. 1, cognitively. Yes, knowledge gives us a map. 2, emotionally. I would say not necessarily, because the old pathways of helplessness, anger, rage, shame, and projection, or turning that anger against the self, you're such an idiot, are deeply embedded in his personality, and therefore relational templates. In other words, the way he sees the world. And that's the stuff we need to get at. That's what happens when you're dealing with a personality disorder, something that the doctor, I don't think, was very skilled with in these interventions. I don't know if he fully appreciated how to work with a personality disorder, in other words, and how deeply ingrained it is in terms of the way you see the world. And 3, so we're back to, I'm just reviewing. Does the knowledge help? And I said there were a few levels to this. 1, cognitively, it does help. 2, emotionally, not necessarily, because I don't think it touches that. And 3, the real help and healing happens when this knowledge can be felt, held in the presence of another who then doesn't shame us for it. So in other words, it's something that Frank has to be able to go through and experience, a very shameful experience with another who's not just telling him, this is the reason why you felt this way. In that moment, Frank seems to long for something more than intellectual understanding, a way out of repeating the feelings and the pattern. I think that's what he's looking for. The work then becomes about tolerating helplessness, recognizing that anger and shame are projections, and slowly building a more integrated self that can hold complexity without collapse. But you may still be asking, how do I speak to this? So just to be very clear, I know I've done this already, but I might say something like, when you were pacing, what were you picturing in your mind? Remember, I went over this a bit, a couple moments ago, but I would keep going. Did it feel like something was about to fall apart, or had it already fallen apart? The goal here is to get to the affective truth of the experience before the defenses set in. Again, I'm reviewing, but this is so critical, and review is always helpful. Rage isn't the problem. Shame is not the problem. These are covers, okay? When you say somebody is feeling helpless, right, that's a word, and it maybe could frame it, but it's the beginning of a place to start to explore something and all of what helplessness means to Frank. So then I would continue, depending on how this was going, and gently, maybe I would add, I wonder if in that moment, the part of you that had everything tightly planned, every piece of the day perfectly slotted, was trying to keep something else from breaking through, something more painful. I mean, does that even make sense? Does that resonate with you at all? See, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm asking these questions, I'm building up to this, and then I'm checking in with him. I'm not the authority on this. That's the entry point. Not to tell him what he's feeling, but to create space for him to wonder. Because the work isn't to explain the grandiose self. It's to loosen its grip. And I went into this in that 4-part series. If you haven't heard it yet, I would suggest maybe you should check it out. It's the 4-part series on how we heal narcissism with a particular focus on the grandiose sense of self. So the goal is to loosen its grip. And that can only happen through a live emotional encounter where the therapist can hold what the patient cannot yet hold for themselves, and then help the patient begin to see, once it's digested in the therapist, what it is that they can't hold, if that makes sense. What's underneath the shame and the rage? Often it is true. Helplessness, abandonment, fear of being forgotten, or failed again. Someone is not showing up. Someone is not there for me. Someone doesn't care enough to show up on time. This is what typically begins to emerge spontaneously as this stuff is explored. So I hope that makes sense. All of these things, and then oftentimes you can now hear the grandiose structure when these memories begin to emerge. Like, for example, as you explore this stuff and they start to reflect back on how somebody wasn't there for them. Perhaps they were left waiting too long after school. What's going on now is the grandiose structure is loosening up, but in a more controlled way. This is the way we want vulnerability to begin to emerge. And when that grandiose structure does loosen, even if only for a moment, and something more real breaks through, that's when I might ask, what does it feel like to imagine that this delivery person has a life just as complicated and fragile as yours? You see here, I'm not just saying, oh, you have empathy, and that's something to feel proud of. No, now I want to see how it felt to look at this person, the delivery woman, as a whole person. I want to pull that moment into focus because later, when Frank reflected on it, he said something that really struck me. How did I get lucky in that moment? If I could reproduce that, he said, I wouldn't be the piece of shit person I am. That's exactly why I'd want to slow this moment down in session. Because what initially appears as a moment of empathy, like spontaneous empathy, or the collapse of the projection, the emerging authentic self, quickly gets overtaken by what? Self-loathing. This is a powerful and heartbreaking shift that we see all too often. A genuine moment of connection turned into a reason for deeper self-attack. And I quote, I'm a piece of shit. And while this opens up a whole other rich line of inquiry about the internalization of cruelty and the superego's hijacking of growth, of empathy, we won't have time to fully explore that today because we have to begin wrapping things up. Many of the patients I work with, and maybe you listening right now, don't have full access to what they truly feel. It's elusive, unformulated, beyond words. You can attend a seminar and acquire theory. You could read books and learn about concepts, but real transformation doesn't come from explanation. It comes from a moment, an experience. The goal isn't just to describe the grandiose self, but to loosen its grip by making contact with the unspoken, the split off, and again I quote, the unthinkable. Frank didn't need more insight. He was a smart guy. He needed someone to stay with him long enough for something else to emerge. Something already in him. Something he didn't yet have words for, but which, if met with enough patience, might begin to be felt and spoken. Okay, we have to hold off here for now. But if any part of this felt close to home, even if you can't quite say why or what, you might not need to understand it just yet. Just stay near it. Let it breathe. And feel free, as always, to reach out and let me know how this landed. Until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.